Hi everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our 2-part video on constructing voice. In our first video, we've already examined what voice is and how it's constructed. However, in this video, we're going to be looking at the really realistic application of voice to actual texts. So looking at prose, poetry, and drama, and how voice is used in different ways in each of these text types to have an impact on you as the reader. So let's start by looking at voice in prose. Now, authors must create an authentic and believable voice in order to have a successful piece of writing. If a voice doesn't sound genuine, it's just going to seem like the author isn't a good writer, and it's therefore going to be hard to relate to the text because what they've produced won't seem to be quite right. Prose allows the use of narration, dialogue, and extensive discussion, and all of these things are going to be contributing to the concept of voice. So let's take a look at an example of voice used in prose. And what we're going to be looking at is the novel Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Now, Mark Twain altered the spelling and grammar of his two characters to create distinctive voices. He writes as Huck, who's a young boy, and Jim, who's an African-American slave. So as we were discussing in part 1 of this video, a really important element of voice is comparing and contrasting voices with each other. So Huck and Jim really present very different voices, and the contrast of these voices has implications on the story. It's set in the 1800s in America. At this extract, which we're going to be looking at, the two characters have run away from home and are having a discussion about ghosts while they're floating down a river. So we'll look at this extract now. Did you ever see a ghost, Jim? We'll see here that this has a very innocent, childlike voice. So this is Huck who's talking at this point. The question's really suggesting, wonderment, amazement, and curiosity. So, have you ever seen a ghost? Tell me your story. This is contrasted to the voice of Jim that then comes in. Has I ever seen a ghost? Well, I reckon I has. This expression of accent and poor grammar is really giving an indication of Jim's rough voice. He's not educated, he's lived his life as a slave, and his voice reflects that. And then we get the contrast back to Huck. Tell me about it, Jim, tell me about it. So again, we're getting the excited, childlike tone. The exclamation marks and the repetition combined with the oh and the tell me about it, is really creating that sense that this is a little boy who's very interested in what this man has to say. We then get the contrast back to Jim's voice. The storms are ripping and a tearing and a carrying on, so a body can't hardly talk, but I reckon I'll try. So we get that sense then with accents and colloquialism. The fact that words are contracted, ripping and tearing, and words like N being used that aren't actual words, are providing the sense that this voice is very distinctive in that it's rough, it's uneducated, and undeveloped. Interestingly, the technique of crossing out words here is also allowing the author to express his voice and to demonstrate his writing process. Now let's look at voices in poetry. So, like in prose, poetry can express voice through the use of language, poetic techniques, and the creation of tone. Structure is also a key element in providing a voice to poetry. So we'll be looking at those ideas in a traceable extract. So the example which we'll be looking at for poetry is the poem My Last Dutchess. Alfonso, the Duke of Ferrara, is basically in this poem showing a visitor a portrait of his dead wife, who was a young and lovely girl. His musings, however, give way to discussion of her disgraceful behaviour, for example, the fact that she flirted with everyone she ever met. The reader realises, as the poem progresses, that the Duke in fact caused the Duchess's early death. So what starts as quite a happy poem ends as a very sinister one, as you realise that the Duke probably murdered his wife. So this is the very beginning of the poem. That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now, for our Pandulph's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. Wilt it please you to sit and look at her? So here, The mix of first and second person and rhetorical questions really gives the sense that this voice is having a conversation with a partner. The partner's silent and not saying anything, but you really get the sense that they're there and that this voice who's telling the story is making a big show of showing the person around and asking them to be comfortable in his home. Highlighted next is the fact that language perhaps hints his sense of jealousy and an attitude of ownership towards the Duchess. So the voice, my last Duchess, and I call that piece a wonder now, really suggests that he owns this woman as a possession. So obviously that's suggestive of his perhaps patriarchal voice and the connotations that has for his 1800s context. In this next extract, we also see the voice being further developed. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whate'er she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. Sir, 'twas all one. So in this extract, the use of dashes show pause in thought, and also a slight change in the tone of his voice. So you get the sense that he's actually thinking as he talks, saying, she had a heart, how will I put it, what will I say, too soon made glad. So that tone of colloquialism and conversation is really coming out through this voice. Exclamations also show that beneath his calm exterior, the persona is a passionate and perhaps an angry man. So, sir, 'twas all one. That very strong exclamation really gives that sense. The next extract also furthers this development of the voice. So, Fra Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half-flush that dies along her throat. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought. So, what's highlighted here is direct quotations. The author is directly quoting Fra Pandolf, who was the portrait painter for his wife. So you're getting a lot of voices coming through in this, not just the voice of the narrator, but also the literal quoted voices of other characters. What is significant is that he is quoting dialogue which he imagined took place, but never actually happened. So he's imagining this scene and the way that his wife reacted. This wasn't really true. It shows his paranoia and immense jealousy. Thirdly, we're going to be looking at voices in drama. So, like as we've already looked at in prose and poetry, voice is an extremely important element in creating authenticity and relatability to the audience. So in drama, it is the playwright's role to create authentic voices for the characters and express these through script. The playwright might also show his or her own voice through the use of narration. So these are two contrasting ways in which voice can be expressed. So let's look at the example of the play The Death of a Salesman, which was written by Arthur Miller. Now, this play pictures Willie, who was a 1950s family man who believed in the ideas of the American dream and easy money. All of his self-worth is tied up in his job as a salesman, and in this scene he's just been fired by a man younger than himself, and his voice starts to come through. He feels his life and his dreams are failing him. So obviously this internal frustration is going to be expressed through his exterior voice. So, we start with the stage direction, desperately. Just let me tell you a story, Howard. When I was a boy, 18, 19, I was already on the road, and there was a question in my mind as to whether selling had a future for me. Because in those days, I had a yearning to go to Alaska. See, there were 3 gold strikes in 1 month in Alaska. Just for the ride, you might say. So highlighted firstly here is the conversational and colloquial tone. So you get the sense that Willie is telling the story to this person, and he's also being quite polite in his language. So, just let me tell you a story. He's pleading, and he's telling it as a story through things like see and you might say. The dashes also show pause, which also indicates change of tone. This is really suggestive of the fact that he's being cut off mid-sentence. So after Howard, just let me tell you a story, Howard, we're getting the sense that Howard is perhaps butting in, interrupting the dialogue of the scene, perhaps through action or through words. The dashes are also used to show the fact that he's thinking and he's frustrated and he's tense. This is a very awful situation for him, and the dashes are pauses which really show that situation to the reader. There was a question in my mind as to whether selling had a future for me, also shows his desperation to be important, successful, and loved. So we see the literal content of what he says directly links to the voice of his character, which is expressed throughout the play. Before we finish this video, we're going to be looking at the way in which you as a writer can develop your own voice. So not only the ways in which you can trace voice in existing texts, but the way that you can create it. The first technique is authenticity versus fantasy. So it's really important that you don't write about what you haven't either experienced or researched. The voice which you create must be realistic and authentic. So if you want to write about what you know, this is going to be a lot easier and a lot more realistic, and therefore successful. The second technique is emotion. Expressing emotion through voice is extremely important. While writing, imagine what you might say in real life if you were feeling or doing what your characters were doing. So actually think, if I was in their shoes, what would I be doing? You can also show that your characters have a range of emotions through really contrasting different emotions between characters and among characters themselves. Thirdly, you need to ensure that you have a good balance of informal and formal language. So this will involve carefully choosing what language you'll use based on your character. Balancing language styles through, for example, mixing narration, description, and dialogue is a really good way of varying voice and creating a really well-rounded voice. It's also really important to ensure that the dialogue is realistic and not too formal. Things like that's going to seem very jolted and not very realistic if language just isn't as it would be in real life. Fourthly, a really good piece of advice is to read widely. Seek inspiration from successful authors of prose, poetry, and drama. You can look to these texts for tips about language, structure, and style. So seek inspiration from texts that you read and channel these into your own writing when you're constructing your own voice. You can try and adapt these ideas to your own style. The final technique is to experiment. So practice using different and varied voices. You should also use, for example, different accents, tones, and create a really broad range of characters. So don't always create the same voice, really experiment with different styles and different voices. So that brings us to the end of our two-part video on voice. In this video, we've not only examined what voice is, but we've literally looked at the ways in which we can trace it in prose, poetry, and drama. We can also see the way in which, through having an understanding of voice and how it's used, you can construct your own creative texts extremely successfully. So by channeling these techniques into your own writing, you can use a theoretical understanding of voice, not only in your essays, but also in your creative pieces.